In the year 73 BCE, when the Roman Republic believed itself secure at the center of the world, the trouble began in a place designed to be forgotten. Outside Capua, in the rich flatlands of Campania, stood a gladiatorial school whose walls enclosed no politics, no ambitions, and no future, only trained bodies waiting for their turn to perish well. Rome was old by then, confident, saturated with victory. It had defeated kings, absorbed nations, and learned to mistake habit for permanence. To understand what occurred there, one must first understand what a gladiator was, and what he was not. Gladiators were not simply slaves, though many were enslaved. They were a category apart, men legally reduced to property, yet publicly celebrated, denied civic personhood, yet admired for virtues Rome claimed to prize. Some had been captured in war, others condemned criminals, others volunteers ruined by debt or hunger, who sold their bodies for the chance of fame and survival. All were bound by contract or force to fight under strict discipline. They trained like soldiers, lived like livestock, and died as entertainment. In a society that wrapped violence in law, the gladiator made that violence visible, ritualized, aestheticized, and safely contained within the arena. The school at Capua reflected this contradiction perfectly. It was not a dungeon, but an institution, orderly, efficient, and profitable. Men rose at fixed hours, drilled with professional care, ate rations calculated to preserve strength without encouraging hope. They were inspected the way tools are inspected, for flaws and durability. To the crowd, gladiators embodied courage. To their owners, they were capital. To the Republic, they were a spectacle that transformed human suffering into reassurance, proof that power remained firmly in Roman hands. Beyond the walls, Italy lay quiet. The Appian Way carried magistrates, merchants, and soldiers who believed that danger lived at the edges of the map. The Senate argued over offices and debts. Generals looked abroad for wars worthy of their ambition. Slavery, everywhere present, had faded into abstraction, a condition so universal it no longer seemed capable of movement. Rome had learned to count enslaved people without ever quite seeing them. Inside the school were men who had seen Rome from below. Some had fought for it, others against it, most simply endured it. Among them was Spartacus, though nothing yet distinguished him from the others except strength, discipline, and the accident of survival. What occurred next was not conceived as history. It was an interruption, a small decision made under pressure, a breach in routine, a moment when obedience failed. At first, the Republic did not notice, and when it did, it misunderstood. What followed did not announce itself as revolution. There were no proclamations, no banners, no destination declared. Men disappeared from expected places and reappeared where they should not have been, armed, organized, and strangely difficult to suppress. Rome searched for familiar explanations and found none that fit. Was this banditry? Disorder? A temporary inconvenience? Or was something deeper shifting beneath Italy's carefully managed surface? The Republic would take time to decide what it was facing. By then, the questions had already multiplied, not about conquest or power, but about control, fear, and how a society built on submission responds when submission quietly collapses. The morning of the escape, the discipline of the place was working as it always did. The yard, filled with men practicing with wooden weapons, waited to make the real steel feel lighter. There were trainers shouting corrections in the clipped tones of men paid to keep bodies intact until the day they were meant to be broken. Somewhere a bookkeeper was counting rations, and somewhere else a merchant was calculating which fighter would draw the biggest wagers. It was an ordinary day, in an industry of extraordinary cruelty. The plot was not a philosopher's conspiracy. It was practical and small. A handful of men learned that they were soon to be divided, sold, or sent into the arena. The future narrowed. Panic became resolve. They seized what lay within reach: kitchen knives, spits, cleavers. The utensils of feeding turned into the tools of flight. They moved fast, because speed is the first advantage of the desperate. On the road, chance improved their prospects. They intercepted wagons carrying gladiatorial weapons, real iron meant for display and death. The wooden practice blades were thrown aside. Now the fugitives held what Rome had always been careful to place in their hands only under supervision. It is easy, in retrospect, to imagine that a man named Spartacus stepped forward with a grand plan and a clear destination, as if history itself had asked him to lead. The truth is more human and more troubling. Leadership appeared because a crowd forms, and a crowd cannot move far without someone deciding where to step next. Some among the fugitives were Gauls and Germans, men like Crassus and Unsettling in later accounts, and their languages and tempers were not the same. What they shared was not a nation, but a condition. They had been cut loose from every legal protection, and Rome had already made its decision about their lives. The question was no longer whether they were criminals. The question was whether they could remain living criminals for more than a day. They ran toward Vesuvius. At that time, the mountain was not yet the famous volcano of later ruin. It was a wooded height above the plain, a place with steep sides and irregular paths, more useful for hiding than for building. From its slopes a man could see the grid of Roman order spread across the countryside: roads, farms, villas, the geometry of ownership. Below, in the heat, lay the prosperity that slavery maintained. Above, in scrub and shadow, gathered the first small cluster of men who had decided not to die as scheduled. Rome's first response was an insult masquerading as force. The Senate did not send a consul with legions, it sent local authority, a praetor with militia, as if to swat a nuisance before lunch. The name most often attached to this early response is Glaber, a Roman commander whose chief disadvantage was that he believed the Republic's own story, that a band of slaves could not fight like soldiers. He marched to the mountain, found the path most obvious, and camped to starve them out. He assumed the fugitives were trapped because he had defined escape in Roman terms: down the road, through the gate, past the checkpoint. He did not expect them to invent a road where Rome had never bothered to build one. They used vines and rope, slid down a cliff face the Romans had not watched, and came at the camp from behind. A militia becomes helpless when it is surprised. Discipline is a slow achievement, and these men had not earned it. The Roman camp broke. Weapons and supplies fell into the fugitives' hands. The Republic had meant to teach a lesson. It had accidentally provided an arsenal. News travels in Italy the way smoke travels in a dry season, slowly at first, then all at once. On estates and in workshops, among shepherds in the hills and laborers in the fields, a rumor began to circulate. Not a doctrine, but a fact. Men had escaped. Men had beaten Romans. Men were moving armed. For those who lived at the bottom of the Republic, it sounded like the nearest thing to a miracle that the Republic allowed, the sudden failure of inevitability. The band grew. Not every man who joined was a slave. Some were free poor, the displaced, the indebted, the half-criminal survivors of a society that had been shaken by wars and land confiscations. Italy had not been calm for long. Within living memory, it had endured the social war, in which Rome's Italian allies fought for citizenship, and the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, in which Romans learned to slaughter Romans with the same efficiency they had once reserved for foreigners. Veterans had been settled on seized land. Old communities had been bruised and rearranged. The Republic had restored order, but it had not restored trust. Beneath the splendid marble of Roman self-confidence lay a countryside still nursing injuries. On Vesuvius, and then beyond it, Spartacus found himself in possession of a force that no Roman institution had created and no Roman law could contain. The challenge was not to defeat Rome in the abstract. The challenge was to feed and move thousands of people who owned nothing but what they could carry. Armies that conquer can live off tribute and cities. Armies that flee must live off speed, theft, and luck. Every day required decisions that were less heroic than logistical: where to find grain, how to keep men from scattering to drink and rape and ruin the very countryside that had just offered them recruits, how to prevent quarrels from becoming blood feuds, how to turn a mass of anger into something that could march. Spartacus's advantage, if it can be called that, was that he had been trained. Gladiatorial discipline was not military discipline, but it had similarities. The endurance, the familiarity with weapons, the habit of obeying signals. He could drill men. He could punish. He could persuade. Yet the army that gathered around him was not Rome's kind of army, and it could never fully become one. Rome's legions were citizens and allies bound by oath to the state. This was a gathering of the uprooted. Its loyalty was to the next day. As the autumn of 73 BCE gave way to winter, Rome began to understand that something unusual was happening. The Republic had endured slave revolts before, especially in Sicily, where the great estates and the great cruelty had produced earlier storms. Those uprisings had been suppressed, and suppression can breed complacency. Rome remembered victories, not warnings. It did not ask why revolt returned like a fever. It asked only how quickly the fever could be broken. The Senate's delay was not merely ignorance, it was politics. Rome in this era was governed by competition among aristocrats who required public achievement to maintain private power. A distant war could be a ladder for ambition. An internal disturbance was an embarrassment. To treat a slave uprising as a serious war was to admit that Rome's own system had produced a threat. Better to define it down, to hand it to lesser commanders, to keep the great names clean. So the Republic sent more forces, piecemeal, and the revolt continued to live. Every victory made it larger. Every delay made it harder to crush. By the spring of 72 BCE, the countryside of southern Italy had begun to feel the movement of this human mass, the way a landscape feels a flood, not as a single blow, but as repeated pressure, unpredictable and wearing. Villas were raided, storehouses emptied, roads became unsafe. The revolt was not a disciplined campaign to take cities and hold territory. It was an armed migration. It moved where food and opportunity lay, and where Roman troops were not prepared. It avoided walls and sought open ground. It did not establish a capital. It did not mint coins or issue laws. Its existence was its message. Rome's control had holes. In Rome, that message arrived as anxiety. Senators who had spoken confidently of foreign dangers now found their own land uncertain. The Republic could endure defeat abroad with dignity. It could call it misfortune, blame a general, raise another army. But disorder in Italy threatened something more intimate: the belief that Rome's supremacy was natural. When the foundation shakes, the marble trembles. 2 consuls were elected and sent with legions. The names attached to them vary in the sources, but the pattern is clear. At last, the state treated the problem as a war. It is here that the revolt's internal tensions become visible, for when a movement grows, it becomes less unified. not more. Men had joined Spartacus for many reasons: revenge, freedom, plunder, sheer panic. Some wished to go home to the north. Some wished to stay and carve out a life by force in the south. Some wished for nothing but loot and intoxication. There was no senate in the hills, no constitution, no agreed end. One faction, led in later tradition by Crassus, split away. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps quarrel, perhaps the simple reality that a mass of armed men cannot always be held together. They moved separately, raiding and fighting. Roman forces caught them near Mount Garganus, and the result was a slaughter. The revolt's dead were not merely bodies, they were lessons. Rome, when it applied itself, could still kill efficiently. Spartacus responded in the only way such movements can respond, with retaliation staged as ritual. Prisoners were forced to fight to the death, gladiator fashion, as if to mock Rome's own games. In that grim parody lay a truth the Republic did not like to hear. The violence it applauded in the arena did not remain politely on the sand when it escaped into the countryside. Spartacus then marched north. This is the decisive direction that later generations would debate, because it is the direction away from Rome. If he had dreamed of taking the city, he would have moved along the roads that led toward it, gathering strength and striking at the heart. Instead, the movement pushed up the spine of Italy toward the passes and the alpine routes that led out of the peninsula. It is not proof of intention. History rarely grants proof. But it is evidence of habit. When the revolt was at its strongest, it moved toward the exit. Italy narrows as one travels north. The landscapes change, from the broad estates of Campania to the hills and valleys of central Italy, then into the plains and riverlands that feed into the Po. The farther the army moved, the more complicated its relationship with Rome became. In the south, it was among estates and slaves, in terrain familiar with inequality. In the north, it approached regions where free communities were more common, where Roman and Italian identities were more mixed, where the revolt's presence looked less like liberation and more like invasion. Roman armies attempted to trap it. They moved in pincers, seeking to block routes, to force battle on Roman terms. Yet the revolt continued to slip, to strike one Roman column and then another, to use speed and surprise. Spartacus did not seek pitched battle as a matter of principle. He accepted it as necessity, and necessity, for a time, favored him. Somewhere near the northern reaches of Italy, close enough to the Alps that the air begins to sharpen and the idea of escape becomes geographical rather than imaginative, the revolt faced a moment of possibility. The passes lay ahead. Beyond them were lands less tightly held by Roman law: Gaul, Germania, the wide territories from which so many of these men had been taken. In later accounts, this is where Spartacus urged dispersal, to break the army into smaller groups, each making its way home as best it could, dissolving into the forests and mountains and distance. An army that disperses cannot conquer. It can only vanish. But vanishing, for men pursued by a state, is a kind of victory. He did not get it. The reasons are as old as crowds. Many did not want to abandon the life they had just seized. The north meant cold, mountains, uncertainty, hunger, the risk of crossing hostile territories without supplies. The south meant familiar warmth and familiar wealth, estates ripe for plunder, cities whose roads and granaries were known. Some had no home to return to. Their villages had been erased, their families sold. Others had acquired tastes that desperation does not easily surrender: wine, jewelry, the strange intoxication of frightening Roman masters. And there was another fact, quieter and more dangerous. An army that disperses stops being an army, and the men who have learned to obey a leader rarely wish to become solitary fugitives again. So the revolt turned back. That turn did not place Rome under immediate siege. It did something subtler. It condemned the movement to remain inside the system it was trying to escape. Every day in Italy increased the army's size and Rome's determination. Every raid intensified Roman fear, and Roman fear is a resource the aristocracy knows how to convert into authority. In Rome, the Senate's patience thinned. Roman society had a deep superstition about slaves, not that they were weak, but that they were dangerous when gathered. The household depended on obedience, and obedience depended on terror. A slave army roaming Italy threatened not only property, but imagination. It invited every enslaved person to picture the moment of refusal. The Republic could endure many insults, but it could not endure the spread of that picture. A man was needed who could impose discipline not only on the enemy, but on Rome's own response. The choice fell on Marcus Licinius Crassus, a figure in whom the Republic's contradictions were concentrated. He was rich beyond measure, a man whose fortune was built on real estate and opportunism in the aftermath of civil violence. He was not loved, but he was useful. He craved military glory because money without honor was an incomplete power in Rome. The Senate gave him command, and with it, permission to be harsh. Crassus's first enemy was not Spartacus. It was Roman indiscipline. Commanders had failed, not merely because the revolt fought well, but because Rome had treated the war as beneath its dignity. Crassus corrected that with cruelty. He punished failures with a severity that belonged more to Rome's ancient legend than to its present comfort. Decimation, the killing of 1 man in 10 from a disgraced unit, was revived not because it was efficient, but because it was terrifying. The Republic, faced with a threat it could not name, reached back into its own memory of savagery and pulled it forward. With Crassus, the war changed character. It became systematic. Roman legions built, marched, fortified, pursued with method. The revolt could still win fights, still surprise, still slip away, but it could no longer rely on Roman carelessness as an ally. Spartacus was no longer fighting local militia and embarrassed praetors. He was fighting Rome when Rome decided to behave like Rome. Spartacus moved south toward the toe of Italy, into Bruttium, where the land narrows and the sea presses in. The choice was not romantic. It was strategic and desperate. In the deep south, the revolt could not be easily enveloped. The geography limited Roman maneuvers. It also offered an exit, not across mountains, but across water. Sicily lay nearby, separated by a narrow strait. Sicily had been the scene of earlier slave wars. Its great estates and harsh discipline made it fertile ground for revolt. If Spartacus could bring his army there, he might ignite another uprising, stretch Rome's forces, perhaps even secure ships, and vanish into the broader Mediterranean. Sea routes, unlike roads, do not end at Roman checkpoints. The water offered something the Alps could not: movement without pursuit. He sought ships. Here the war enters the realm where necessity meets betrayal. Spartacus negotiated with pirates, Cilicians in later tradition, men for whom loyalty was a temporary convenience. They took payment and promised transport. The revolt gathered near the shore, waiting. The ships did not come. Whether the pirates were bribed by Rome, frightened by Crassus, or simply dishonest by nature, the result was the same. The sea, for Spartacus, became another closed gate. This moment is among the clearest windows into his predicament. A man trying to conquer Rome does not bargain for passage out of Italy. A man trying to seize the Republic does not gamble his future on the punctuality of pirates. The revolt's movement again and again leaned toward escape routes, and again was pulled back into the peninsula by the gravity of its own size and the tightening net of Roman power. Crassus exploited that tightening with an engineer's imagination. Across the narrow neck of land that led into the southernmost peninsula, he ordered the construction of a vast line, trench, rampart, wall, a barrier meant to pen the revolt against the sea. It was a work of labor and discipline on a grand scale, a reminder that Rome's greatest weapon was not the sword, but organization. Where the revolt had improvised roads down cliffs, Rome built a frontier inside its own country. For Spartacus, the wall was not merely earth and timber. It was a decision imposed by an enemy: fight, starve, or break through. The winter of 72 to 71 BCE settled in. The southern hills are not the Alps, but cold still arrives, and rain turns roads into mud, and men in makeshift camps feel the teeth of hunger. The revolt's condition, already precarious, worsened. Thousands of people cannot live indefinitely on plunder in a confined space. The countryside had been stripped. Roman pressure cut off movement. The army began to fracture under the weight of survival. Under such pressure, an army becomes what it truly is. Some men slipped away at night in small bands, taking their chances with the countryside rather than with starvation in camp. Roman patrols hunted them. Many were killed. Others grew reckless, eager for battle as a kind of release. Spartacus had to hold together not only a military force, but a population, and population panics when food runs thin. He chose to break out. One night, in foul weather that dulled Roman vigilance, Spartacus's men filled portions of the trench with earth, branches, whatever they could drag, and forced a crossing. Fighting erupted along the line, close, confused, brutal. In the chaos, a gap opened, and a large part of the revolt surged through. Not all made it. Thousands were left behind or scattered, but enough escaped that the war continued, now looser, more desperate, and running out of time. The breakout did not send Spartacus toward Rome. It sent him north again, back up the peninsula, as if repeating the earlier instinct, away from the deep south, away from the tightening corner, toward open routes and the possibility of vanishing. By this stage, Rome's response had become more than one man's campaign. The Senate, anxious to end the humiliation, had authorized additional forces. Pompey was returning from Spain with veteran troops, and Lucullus approached from the east. The Republic was converging on the revolt from multiple directions, not only to destroy it, but to prevent its escape. Rome may have been slow to notice the first spark, but once alarmed, it could bring overwhelming weight. That convergence altered the war's meaning. Spartacus now faced not only Crassus, but the fact that even if he evaded one army, another waited. The peninsula that had once offered roads and countryside now began to feel like a trap. Italy, which the Republic had shaped into a secure heartland, revealed its other function. It was a bowl, and Rome was the rim. In this tightening, the revolt's political emptiness became a liability. A movement without a declared program can grow quickly because it demands little agreement, but it cannot negotiate because it has nothing to offer but its own disappearance. If Spartacus had wanted a seat at Rome's table, he would have needed a vision Rome could recognize, a treaty, a state, a claim. He had none. He could not plausibly ask the Senate to abolish slavery. He could not credibly offer peace as equals. The most he could hope for was passage, and passage is not the kind of request empires grant once they are afraid. There are hints in later tradition of Spartacus seeking negotiation, of offering exchanges, of attempting terms, But the record is thin and written by men who loved to place speeches and motives into the mouths of the dead. What can be said with confidence is that by the end, the revolt fought not for conquest, but for room, and Rome fought not for territory, but for example. As spring approached in 71 BCE, the movements became sharper. Crassus pursued with method, aiming to force battle. Spartacus maneuvered to avoid being pinned between armies. Skirmishes flared, detachments were cut off, small disasters accumulated. The revolt, once massive, was now a wounded animal running through a narrowing corridor. Somewhere in Lucania, the final decision arrived not as rhetoric, but as geography. Crassus closed in. Pompey's presence in the north threatened to cut off any escape route. The revolt could not live indefinitely on movement alone. Hunger and fatigue do not negotiate. Spartacus faced a choice that had been approaching for months: to continue scattering into bands that Rome could hunt down one by one, or to gather what strength remained and attempt a decisive battle. He gathered them. It is here that the romantic imagination wants to elevate the moment into prophecy. The reality is starker. A leader with thousands of desperate followers cannot simply disappear. He carries them, and they carry him. If Spartacus had been alone, he might have vanished into the hills. But he was the center of a mass, and the mass was running out of days. The battlefield, in the accounts, lies near a river. The Silaris is often named, in southern Italy. The ground would have been open enough for legions to deploy, close enough to roads for supplies, far enough from Rome to make the Senate feel both relief and insult. Relief that the danger had not reached the city, insult that it had lasted so long in the countryside. The air would have smelled of spring and old smoke, the way battlefields always smell when the earth is wet and men are frightened. Crassus drew up his legions in the Roman manner, ordered lines, reserves ready, commanders positioned to direct. Spartacus's army was less uniform, but by then it had fought enough to know the difference between chaos and formation. These men were not playing at war. They had been at war for 2 years, and experience is a hard teacher. Before the clash, Spartacus did something that later writers loved to interpret. He is said to have killed his horse. The gesture has been read as defiance, no retreat, victory, or death. It may also have been practicality. A leader on horseback is a target, and the battle would soon be close. Whatever the intention, the symbol endured because it fit what Rome wanted to believe: that this enemy was driven by a fatal pride rather than by exhaustion and necessity. The battle began with the push of bodies and the scream of iron. Roman discipline does not remove fear, it channels it. The legions advanced, shields locked, spear and sword doing their careful work. The revolt fought with the ferocity of men for whom defeat meant not simply death, but example. Crucifixion, torture, the public theater of warning. The Roman state had made surrender unthinkable by making punishment imaginative. Spartacus, according to later tradition, fought toward Crassus himself, trying to reach the commander as if killing the head might loosen the body. It is a natural impulse, and it appears often in stories because it satisfies a moral logic, the small man seeking the great man. Whether he reached Crassus or not, the attempt reveals something about the revolt's psychology at the end. This was not an army trying to conquer an empire. It was an army trying to break a net. It sought not Rome's institutions, but Rome's grip. The revolt broke. Some fought to the last. Others fled and were hunted down. Spartacus died in the chaos, and his body, in most accounts, was never confidently identified. That absence is more than a detail. Rome liked to display the bodies of its enemies, to close the narrative with a corpse. The lack of a confirmed body left a space into which legend could later pour itself. It is easier to mythologize a man who does not end as a photographed trophy. Crassus had won the battle that mattered to him, but he had not yet won the political war. In Rome, glory is always contested. Pompey, arriving as the revolt's remnants were being hunted, claimed credit for finishing the last bands. The Senate, eager to reward whomever could stabilize Italy, played the two men against each other. The suppression of Spartacus became one more event in the Republic's slow conversion of military success into political leverage. The punishment was calculated and immense. Along the Appian Way, the great road from Capua to Rome, the artery of Italy, thousands of captured rebels were crucified. The crosses were spaced so that a traveler could not escape the sight of them. It was not enough for Rome to kill. Rome had to teach. No act better exposes the Republic's character in this era. A state confident in its legitimacy does not need to line its roads with bodies. A state that fears imitation does. The crucifixions were aimed not at the dead, but at the living, at every slave on every estate, at every poor man tempted by disorder, at every magistrate who had been slow to respond. The message was not simply, "Do not rebel." It was, "Rome will make your suffering useful to Rome." And yet the uprising had already spoken its own message, one the Republic could not entirely erase. For 2 years, a mass of the enslaved and the dispossessed had moved through Italy and defeated Roman forces repeatedly. They had not built a rival state. They had not captured the capital. They had not proclaimed a new order. They had done something more unsettling. They had demonstrated that the Republic's control, so absolute in theory, depended on constant maintenance, on vigilance, on fear, on organization, on the willingness to apply cruelty when necessary. Later ages would search for Spartacus as a symbol of freedom, because symbols are what later ages do with the inconvenient dead. But in his own time, his most telling characteristic was not the purity of his cause, but the direction of his movement. Again and again, when opportunity appeared, the revolt leaned toward exits, first toward the mountain, then north toward the passes, then toward the sea. Again and again, circumstance, internal division, and Roman pressure pulled it back. The revolt's tragedy was not that it failed to conquer Rome, it was that it could not leave Rome's world. The Republic survived, but it did not emerge unchanged. It had elevated commanders by granting them extraordinary authority. It had revived ancient brutalities and made them modern again. It had taught ambitious men that fear could be harvested into power. Crassus gained prestige and demanded recognition. Pompey gained prestige and demanded more. And the Republic, already weakened by decades of violence and rivalry, moved further into the age where legions answered to generals before they answered to laws. In that sense, Spartacus's war belongs less to the history of revolutions than to the history of systems revealing themselves. A revolt of gladiators began as an escape from a school outside Capua, a refusal to die for sport. It grew into a migrating crisis that forced Rome to look at the underside of its prosperity. When it ended, the roads of Italy carried a warning in wood and iron, and the Senate could claim order restored. But order, once restored by terror, never quite returns to what it was before.